Welcome to part 2 of my G.I. Joe Jeep rehab project. I'll leave links to part 1 at the end of this video and in the description section of this video. In part 1 of this series, I found an old G.I. Joe Jeep that had been well used in the day and was in need of some love to repair and detail to match the Jeeps I remember from my service in the Canadian Armed Forces Militia some 45 years ago. I acquired some repair parts, took off the wheels to make repairs easier. Next, I added a wire cutter to the front of the Jeep, added a slave cable socket and housing, built and installed a new rear bumper, enclosed the back area, and added a mounting for the spare tire. So let's get going and continue the renovation work. Time to carry on work on the rear end of the Jeep by making a mount for the jerry can. We'll get started by taking a few measurements and use these measurements to mark up a piece of scrap sheet metal. Time to do a bit of sheet metal origami at the vise. And there we have it. The jerry can holder is in place. When I was doing some editing on these Jeep rehab videos, I noticed that a crack was forming beside the bumper at the rear of the Jeep. I reinforced the area by gluing some styrene behind the affected area and clamping it until the glue set. Hopefully this will strengthen the area enough to prevent further cracking, though I don't plan to be putting much force on this bumper anyways, so I think this should be sufficient. We will turn our attention to the radio equipment carried by these recon Jeeps in the 1970s, starting with the antenna pillar normally mounted behind the spare tire at the rear of the Jeep. I marked out the antenna mast on sheet metal as I did previously on earlier parts, but since the part is a lot smaller and the bends had to be a lot tighter, I was not happy with the result, as there was very noticeable gaps in the assembled mast. I cut and mounted styrene using super glue to wrap the top of the mast where the antenna would mount, and the result was acceptable. But if I were to do this again, I would make the entire mast out of styrene. Next, it was time to mount the back seat in the Jeep that I obtained on eBay from a seller in Hong Kong. I started by positioning the seat roughly where I wanted it, then marked the location to drill the holes for the seat legs. It was time to mount the back seat in the back of the Jeep. I'm not going to glue the seat in place, so that it is easier to remove it for painting and to adjust to fit an action figure later on should I choose to do so. After mounting the seat, I noticed that the back wall of the Jeep is beginning to look like a dog's breakfast, with all the screws and styrene bracing I had used to mount the various parts. I made a styrene cover plate that can be removed should I need to get at the screws located on the back wall of the Jeep. The result looks much better. G.I. Joe can now ride in style in the back seat of the Jeep.
We're now going to move on and do some work on the main body of the Jeep. I temporarily mounted the windshield so that I can mark its position on the body so that I don't put detailed parts where it would be interfered with that. Because I'm going to be putting on a GPMG mount on the passenger side of the Jeep. GPMG stands for General Purpose Machinegun. And it's marked where the windshield has to have movement. Next we'll begin to fill in and file smooth the holes that aren't needed for mounting items on this Jeep, such as where the mount for the shovel was, where the spare tire would be, and where the side marker lights would have been. To do this, on the inside of the body where it isn't visible, I glue a little bit of styrene over the hole. At a local hobby shop, I found this putty which I'll use to fill the hole. I squeeze a bit of the putty into each hole. I'm using a bit of scrap styrene, try to smooth it out a bit.
Afterwards, I left the putty to dry overnight so that I could be sure it was fully set when I went to sand it. Next up, I turned my attention to the dashboard of the Jeep by installing a panic bar on the passenger commander side of the Jeep. I got the bar material by cutting the needed length from an old wire coat hanger. At the vise, I added in two 90-degree angles. Using a pin vise, I drilled two mounting holes in the dashboard. I fitted the panic bar in place on the dashboard and set it with some super glue. Next, we will tackle the mount for the GPMG, or General Purpose Machinegun. In the 1970s, when I served in the Canadian Armed Forces Militia, Canada was using a version of the venerable Browning M-1919 machine gun that was rechambered to fire 7.62 NATO ammunition. And on the passenger side of the Jeeps we used was this oddly shaped mount beside the slave cable housing that formed part of the mount for the GPMG. And during my time with the SALH in Edmonton, this was as much of the mount for the GPMG that we normally saw, as at the time, as far as I remember 45 years later, the SALH in Edmonton had only one GPMG for the entire unit, so we didn't mount the GPMG on the Jeep. There was only one time I saw the GPMG mounted on a Jeep, and I thought it was a neat setup that I wanted to include on my G.I. Joe Jeep. Fitted over the bracket mounted on the Jeep was this oddly shaped affair that allowed the GPMG to be stowed when not in use to the side of the Jeep with either the windshield down or in the up position. When needed, the windshield would be lowered and the GPMG swung in front of the commander for his use. I'll start by making the mounting bracket to attach to the Jeep. There are 3 parts to the Jeep anchor mount for the GPMG. The mounting plate that bolts to the Jeep itself, the top part with the bar for the swing arm to fit over, and a brace piece to strengthen the structure. I cut a piece of styrene to length and drilled 2 holes for the mounting screws, which I superglued to the plate. I drilled holes in the Jeep to accept the 2 screws and temporarily mounted the plate to make sure the plate was where I wanted it to wind up. For the piece at the top, I drilled a hole to fit a nail I cut to length that I'm going to use to attach the GPMG swing arm. I superglued the nail in place on the mounting plate. Along the bottom edge of the strengthening plate, I filed a slot to fit over the screw heads. Now for the messy part. I used model airplane glue and glued the 3 pieces together and adjusted the fit before the glue set. And there we go, one GPMG vehicle anchor, ready to go. I'll take it off until the Jeep is painted. We will now turn our attention to the genuine G.I. Joe M-1919 machine gun and ammo box I obtained from eBay and build the Jeep mounting system for them. Starting with the mount for the ammo box, there is a mounting plate that attaches to the machine gun with the mounting hole for the pintle at the front of the gun and the rear mount attachment. I marked a piece of styrene and cut it to the proper length. Using a pin vise, I drilled the hole for the front of the mounting bar that uses the hole for the pintle on the gun. I then mounted the bar using a nail through the pintle mounting hole. Once I was satisfied with the location of the mounting bar, I flipped over the gun and mount and drilled the rear hole for the mount. Then inserted the rear mounting pin. I had to add an extra piece of styrene to the rear of the bar mount, as the rear hole would not have lined up otherwise. The rest of the ammo box mount will eventually be attached to this mounting bar. I took some measurements of the ammo box. I cut and glued pieces of angle stock styrene around the edge of the bottom plate to form the bottom tray of the ammo box mount. I glued the back plate to the bottom tray at a 90-degree angle. I raided my junk box and found some bar stock to add straps to the ammo box mount. After gluing the tray assembly to the mounting bar, I attached the ammo box mount to the GPMG using the mounting pins. I test fitted the ammo box to the machine gun and will set this structure aside until after painting before making the final attachments. Next, we will turn our attention to the pintle that attaches the machine gun to the machine gun mount. To do this, I bent a piece of 1/4-inch brass stock into a U shape after drilling 3 holes for the mounting nail used to attach the machine gun to the pintle and the pivot rod at the bottom of the pintle to insert into the machine gun mount swing arm. After temporarily assembling the ammo box holder, machine gun, and pintle together, I had to figure out how to fasten them together. I noticed that the small nuts used to attach my wife's stud earrings would do the job nicely. Since she would be mighty annoyed if I took them and left her with stud earrings she could not put on, I ordered the cheapest stud earring nuts I could find on Amazon. I got a pack of 100 of them for just over $10. Once attached to the mounting nails, these small nuts look a lot like wing nuts. When I do the final assembly of the machine gun mount after painting, I'll cut the mounting nails to length. Now we come to the most complicated part of the machine gun mount, the swing arm. What makes this part so complicated is the two 90-degree angles, here and here. If you bent to 90 degrees solid rod stock of sufficient diameter to look correct, it would snap in two, and tube stock would crimp. The manufacturer of the swing arm made it out of two pieces, welded together. And this would introduce another problem if attempted on this small scale. If you tried to solder brass stock, the solder joint would have to be so large it would look unnatural. And if you glued styrene stock together, the joint would be so weak that it would snap apart as soon as it was assembled. After reattaching the GPMG mounting bracket to the Jeep, I created a storyboard to mark the height of the windshield, the top of the mounting pin, and the top face of the mounting bracket. I used this storyboard to mark a piece of 1/4-inch styrene tube stock. I cut a 45-degree angle into the tube stock. As I said earlier, the glue joint for just styrene tubing on its own would not be very strong and would come apart under very little stress. I therefore marked up a piece of coat hanger wire, which I then bent at a 90-degree angle at the vise. I wrapped the wire with masking tape so as to fill the interior of the tubing. I fitted the tubing over the pin of the mounting bracket, and as you can see, it is very wobbly. I made a bearing out of tinfoil held together with some super glue by wrapping it around a nail of the same diameter of the mounting bracket pin, which I then installed in the base of the piece of 1/4-inch tubing. The result is much less wobbly. I inserted the L-bar into the base piece of tubing. I swung the swing arm and marked the length I needed. I wanted the swing arm to end roughly in the middle of the passenger commander area. I marked and cut to length the top part of the tubing and fitted it over the piece of L wire and glued the joint. I made the square part of the mount into which the pintle will attach by gluing bits of styrene stock around a bit of 1/4-inch tubing, then inserted bits of scrap styrene into the tubing to make a solid area. I drilled the hole to fit the pintle pin and a second hole to insert the swing arm. Then glued the block onto the end of the swing arm. Finally, I put the entire GPMG mount assembly together for the first time. I had hoped to make this a fully functional assembly, but the combined weight of the machine gun and ammo box made the structure sag. I'm still pleased with the result, but I think this will have to remain a static display. Well, folks, I think this would be a good spot to end this episode. In part 3, I'll break out the spray paint and paint the Jeep, then do the final assembly by putting on all the parts I purchased and made, and then add some finishing touches. Until we meet again, everyone keep safe and well.